The notice arrived on a Thursday, neon orange, half-folded, taped to my front door like a joke nobody was laughing at. 3 lines, typed neat. Immediate assessment increase. Excess vehicles. $750 monthly. I read it twice, then 3 times, because the first time I thought the number was a typo, the second time I thought it had to be some kind of mistake, and by the third time I realized the thing that had actually surprised me wasn't the fee, it was that someone had finally put into words what everyone in Maple Ridge Cove had been whispering about for years. Control. My name is Ethan Ward. I grew up on the outskirts of places like this, not here, not at Maple Ridge, but in towns where folks were as likely to fix a fence themselves as they were to complain about the HOA at the diner over coffee. I moved here 10 years ago because my mother loved the trees and the quiet, and because the house had a porch that made you want to sit and think, the kind of porch that slows you down a little and lets you hear things you'd been trying not to hear. Back then, the HOA felt like a neighbor with a clipboard, annoying sometimes, sure, but mainly predictable. Over time, the clipboard got heavier and the handwriting sharper. There's a center to all of this, and it's not the orange notice. The center is Clara Beaumont. Clara moved into Maple Ridge Cove 7 years before that notice appeared. If you asked a stranger to picture a neighborhood leader, you'd get Clara in their head. Crisp blazer, silver hair pulled back, a voice with too much polish for the place. She chaired every committee, hosted the welcome breakfasts that doubled as PR, and had a way of making people feel seen until they weren't useful anymore. She built influence like some people build decks, slowly, precisely, with reinforcements where you couldn't see them. I suppose the story begins in the small humiliations, petty fines, notices slipped under my door about my lawn height, warnings about a mailbox that leaned a degree too far. They're boring to tell, which is why they work. Everyone tolerates small unfairness because it's easier than fighting when you've got bills and kids and work. But when those small things begin to stack, when the fines start bleeding into each other until they become a monthly tax on your dignity, then the small stuff stops being tolerable and starts feeling like a pattern. One evening, a neighbor, Greg, from 3 doors down, beard and a truck and a laugh like a bad dog collar, knocked on my porch. He didn't say much at first. He sat and smoked and watched my porch light paint long bars across his boots. "You notice anything weird with Clara's new driveway?" he asked finally. I shrugged. "She's got a lot of friends come by." He rounded his jaw like he was choosing words. "She's been buying up property around the ridge, Ethan. Not houses, not regular houses. Interest where she can vote." The words lodged. That's the thing, people tell you things and you don't register them right away because the obvious explanation is usually the most comforting. I filed it away under neighbor gossip, but a seed was planted. Fast forward a few months. At a board meeting masquerading as a community update, Clara handed out a glossy packet and led a presentation that looked more like a startup pitch than a homeowners association update. She spoke about community optimization and infrastructure sustainability, and then, with the calm of someone reciting the weather, announced a plan to buy adjacent parcels to create buffer zones, land that, she insisted, would preserve property values and protect the neighborhood from undesirable development. Desirable to whom? Nobody asked. The packets had diagrams. The diagrams had layers. The layers had clauses that suggested ownership could be consolidated privately through entities that sounded like they belonged on a corporate cap table, not a cul-de-sac. After the meeting, people clapped politely. The Ridge has a lot of polite people. I, however, had a knot forming in my chest that felt more like a muscle waking up than common sense. I began to notice odd things. A contractor's van parked overnight at empty lots. Envelopes with corporate stamps sent to addresses that had belonged to trees, not taxpayers. When I asked Clara directly about any purchases, she smiled like I'd asked whether she liked pie and told me, "Ethan, all I want is what's best for our community." It's a line you hear a lot from powerful people. They say, "What's best?" and never mention who benefits. That winter I lost sleep over deeds. Maybe lost sleep is dramatic. Maybe it's more accurate to say my curiosity turned into quiet work. I had a little skill set that didn't scream dangerous, but turned out to be useful. An eye for details, a patience for paperwork, and a willingness to spend Saturday afternoons in county clerk's offices while everyone else was on the couch. I started pulling records, titles, and transfer documents, pedestrian, legal documents that map out who owns what. At first, there was nothing unlawful to see. That's the thing about power. It often arranges itself in legal ways that feel ruthless but are technically permissible. But patterns emerge if you're patient. She'd used proxies, LLCs, family trusts, and a lot of paperwork to consolidate control quietly. She'd bought parcels adjoining the neighborhood, a half-acre here, a narrow lot there, all under different names and stage closings. Over time, the sum of those pieces created an option, control over the land around Maple Ridge Cove without appearing to control it. She had influence like an invisible fence. I didn't start with the intention to take her down. I started to keep a ledger because the ledger made me feel less helpless. I made spreadsheets and timelines, and then I made backups. I printed documents and kept them in a folder under my bed the way some people keep hymnals. When you decide to fight a thing you can't fire a gun at or punch in the face, you fight with paper and patience. My preparation was methodical because it had to be, because once you cross from suspicion to action, you have to be right. The first real confrontation came at a community picnic, of all places. Maple Ridge put on an annual barbecue charity, potluck. Kids running with marshmallows, and Clara loved to be on stage at these events, waving like she was meant for the camera. I stood in line for corn and watched her talk to the mayor about strategic neighborhood preservation. When she saw me, she crossed the grass like a ship docking. "Ethan, I didn't realize you were at the meeting last month," she said, chin up. "I hope we have your support." Support is a funny idea when you're the one whose mailbox gets fined because the post is 1 inch off. "Clara," I said, and I tried to keep my voice casual, like this was porch talk. "Where did the funds come from to buy the land over by the river?" She blinked, and for the first time I saw a flicker of something like a human reaction, irritation, maybe, or surprise that someone would ask. "Private investment, Ethan," she said. "It's a common practice. We're protecting the neighborhood. And who benefits from that private investment?" I asked. I felt, then and there, the picnic table eyes on us neighbors who've never been invited to ask questions aloud. Clara smiled her practice smile. "Everyone," she said. "When values go up, everyone wins." There's a difference between rhetoric and reality, and in meetings that difference gets smoothed over like a tablecloth. But in private, that similarity becomes a place of friction. After the picnic, I didn't go home. I started calling people I thought might care, people who'd been fined for weird things, folks who had been told to trim hedges or repaint shutters. Some shrugged me off. Some listened. Greg brought me a box of old meeting minutes he'd been keeping like a squirrel keeps nuts, things people toss out until they matter. I cross-checked minutes against property transfers, and the picture sharpened. When you're not a lawyer, it's wise to find one as a compass. I did. Her name was Marisol, and she'd grown up in a blue house with a garden full of peppers. She ran a small practice, and, like me, she had a tolerant, skeptical smile that suggests she'd seen this play before. "LLC's behind an HOA leader," she said after we spread out my spreadsheets on her kitchen table. "It's a classic. Not illegal on its face. But there's murk if those LLCs use HOA resources or influence to acquire property, or if required disclosures weren't made. There's also a fiduciary duty when you're running an HOA." Her words were precise, and they felt like permission. They also introduced our next problem. How do you get a community to look when the leader signs the checks and hands out the desserts? I'll skip over weeks of quiet work because the middle of this story is mostly made of mundane effort. There were letters to be written, FOIA requests that felt like fishing in a murky pond, and neighborhood meetings where Clara spoke and people clapped. There were nights where I sat at the kitchen table with a lamp on and sorted receipts into piles: legal, suspicious. Nope, until the piles began to have shapes. I learned that power in a place like Maple Ridge is not always violent. It's often bureaucratic. The quietest mechanisms are the most effective because they hide in plain sight. The turning point came when Clara decided to hold a town hall. She announced it with enough fanfare that it might have been a concert if the main attraction wasn't the same woman asking for more authority. "This is an opportunity for the community," her flyer read. "Come with questions." People came. They brought folding chairs and bored expressions and a thirst for coffee. She prepared a presentation, a slideshow with polished bullet points, and a chart that confused people because charts like to confuse unless you're paid to read them. She spoke in a tone that suggested anyone who questioned her commitment lacked imagination. "We must centralize certain decisions," she said. "We must be proactive." Somebody from the back raised a question about transparency: who owns which parcels? Clara answered with the sort of practiced vagueness that smells like a well-worn coin. We'll disclose as appropriate, she said. We have consultants advising us. I stood up because I had to. Maybe it was bravado. Maybe it was the wrong kind of stubborn. But mostly it was fatigue. I was tired of watching my lawn become a symbol on a glossy packet. Clara, I said, and I heard my voice echo like someone calling across a field. Who are these consultants? Are they connected to the entities buying land around the ridge? Now here's something people who have power seldom do. They rarely face direct questions in the moment without having rehearsed the answer. Clara hesitated, a split-second pause that felt like a stitched seam showing. They are independent, she said finally. We engaged firms to ensure fiscal prudence. The crowd murmured. I wasn't satisfied, so I handed a copy of a deed to the community manager and asked the room to read the name on the transfer. It was an LLC with a name that suggested a vineyard, which in turn made no sense in a neighborhood where grapes are decorative at best. That moment, me handing the deed across a table in a fluorescent room, community members leaning in, was small, but it was enough to crack the polish. People saw the name, and then they saw the connection. The murmurs grew. Clara's smile tightened. She asked for the floor and replied with a speech so carefully crafted it could be laminated. This is all above board, she said. We are protecting you. We are looking out for the common good. Sometimes, in public, the truth is a slow-growing thing. You need to feed it facts and shine light on it. After the meeting, a handful of people approached me, not to cheer, but to share little details like how one of the LLCs had listed the same mailing address as Clara's assistant, or how one of the targeted parcels had been supposedly retained for community use, only to end up fenced off. Those details, when aggregated, form a reasonable suspicion. Suspicion is not proof, but it's the start of a trail. When I finally decided to go public, I tried to do it in a way that wouldn't cost anyone more than truth demanded. I organized a packet, all the deeds, records, meeting minutes, and invoices I had, and wrote a calm letter to the HOA board requesting an independent audit, disclosure of any interest the board members might have in nearby parcels, and a vote to approve any future purchases. I sent it via certified mail because certified mail has more integrity than people often give it credit for. Clara responded with a letter from a big firm that smelled like warning shot. They accused me of defamation, of spreading rumors, of disrupting community harmony. The language was affectless and precise. It used legal metaphor like a scalpel. It felt heavy for being so neat. Publicly, she called for civility. Privately, she asked neighbors who supported her to keep to the script. The scripts people follow when defending power are comforting. They provide a map so you can point to a place and say, this is how to behave. I was not a map in her script. That's when things escalated. Maybe escalation is an overused word. Perhaps tightening describes it better. Notices about my lawn went from polite to punitive. Fines landed with the frequency of a loose tooth tapping the same spot. I was called to meetings where board members read from bylaws that no one had ever explained in plain English. Noncompliance became a label you could stick on someone and then proceed to stamp it into their bank account. The Ridge's gossip pipeline did what gossip does. It spread selected truths like fertilizer for fear. Some neighbors, having taken Clara's words on faith for years, looked at me like I'd shoved a stick into a hornet's nest. Others, the ones who'd been fined or shunned, started dropping by with documents and shocked faces. One evening, my mailbox, an old wooden thing I've had since I moved in, was bent back like someone had tried to open it with an elbow. My neighbor Ruth found it and joked poorly about teenagers, but the look on her face was serious. That's when it hit me. This had become more than policy. It was personal for both of us. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. I was trying to stop a system that was built to look like sunshine, but had a foundation of compromise and consolidation. There's a kind of violence in that, a bureaucratic violence. Paper can wound. Money can wound. The weaponized slow turn of bylaws and fines is meant to make people give up. I knew, at some point, that if I wanted to move from complaint to change, I needed allies beyond the cul-de-sac. I needed someone who worked with property law and who liked the fact that the truth is often stubborn. Marisol was willing, and she recommended an auditor. She trusted an old guy named Howard who had retired from county inspections and had a nose for irregularities. Howard was a man with a cane and a laugh like a rolling pin. He came over, walked the lots, looked at the fence lines, and listened to my story without blinking suspiciously like some folks did. He said the right words. This could be messy, but messy sometimes makes people wake up. We organized a petition not loud, not intended to be a mob, but enough to show that this was not one man's paranoia. We gathered signatures. People signed because they didn't like being lied to and because they didn't want their property to be an investment vehicle for a handful of people whose loyalty was to power. The petition requested an independent audit and a vote by the community on any new acquisitions. Clara's reaction was a playbook of escalation and charm. She sent out a letter full of kindness and consequence. She hosted an open house where she served coffee and tried to convince people that centralization was progress. At the same time, she filed an injunction aiming to prevent defamatory acts that, in practical terms, attempted to silence discussion. Legal threats are a special kind of pressure. They don't always land in court, but they make people nervous about signing petitions or speaking up. What followed was a period I will never forget. A public showdown that felt less like a fight and more like a test to see who could keep their nerve. The Ridges Board tentatively scheduled a special vote to consider the audit. This was the moment I had been working toward, the moment where community democracy, such as it was in a place like Maple Ridge, could reassert itself. Clara announced an emergency meeting, her email barbed with concern about community stability. The night of the vote, the meeting room smelled of coffee and sweat and fluorescent bulbs that add drama to everything. I sat in the back with my folder under my arm and watched the people who'd been quiet for so long edge into their seats. Clara took the podium and gave a speech that was, in the theater sense, flawless. She used stories of children playing in yards and seniors walking dogs, the same imagery that binds communities, and wove it into a narrative where her leadership was the umbilical cord to safety. Her supporters clapped. Those who trusted her did so because she had convinced them that fear lay on the other side of questioning. When the floor opened for discussion, I stood up and spoke plainly. I didn't shout. I didn't demand. I laid out the facts, the deeds, the transfers, the LLCs, the assistance address. I asked for a simple, clean remedy, an independent audit, and an immediate disclosure of any board member's interests. I felt my own voice steady itself as other people weighed in. Some said what I said in different words. Some said nothing at all. The vote was called. The tally was close. The community, tired of polite deference and spooked by legal letters, voted for an independent audit by a narrow margin. Clara's face iced over, but she preserved her manners as if they were the only currency left to spend. When the meeting broke up, the small riot of whispers swelled into strategy talk. People wanted answers. The audit began, and then, predictably, things got louder. When an audit probes, it nudges things into daylight that like shade. The auditing team, Howard's crew, quiet and methodical, went through financials and minutes and bank statements. They found things that, read aloud, made people in the council room stop mid-chew of their coffee. There were invoices that seemed to benefit an LLC. There were payments that, while technically valid, raised eyebrows because they flowed through entities that appeared to route money toward properties adjacent to Maple Ridge. There were emails that suggested coordination. Clara's defenders called the findings circumstantial. She called them misreadings. Her lawyers, unsurprisingly, issued statements about context and selective interpretation. The town was divided between those who wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt and those who felt that benefit had been revoked by a pattern of secrecy. Depositions are where people tend to reveal themselves in full. It's where phrases that seem polite in public come loose, and you hear the tone that was hiding under the calm. Under oath, board members testified to meetings that were never recorded and decisions that vanished like smoke. The auditors testified about funds that were rerouted in peculiar ways. Clara testified about her motives, which she described as love for the neighborhood, and when she used the word love, there was an odd, almost desperate sincerity in it. I am not proud to say that in this whole affair I retained a small glee when the documents piled up, the ones that showed a consultant's invoice routed through an LLC that had purchased a buffer lot, the ones that showed a transfer that had the same notary stamp as a contract for community services. Paper may be prosaic, but it has a way of connecting dots that gossip never can. The more papers we had, the less plausible her explanations became. There was a night, near the end of discovery, when I found an email thread that felt decisive. It was a back and forth between Clara's assistant and a consultant, discussing preferred outcomes and controlling interest. They wrote like people arranging a table at a restaurant, selecting who sits where, rather than like people stewarding a neighborhood. That email chain felt like a rope around the narrative Clara had built. Once you see the rope, you can see where knots were tied. The courtroom sequence is the part people imagine when they think of justice. The judge, the gavel, the dramatic reveal. Real courtroom work is quieter and more patient than that. Evidence is filed. Witnesses testify. The jury in our case, an HOA board hearing rather than a jury trial, listens. We presented the pattern. Purchases coordinated through LLCs, board votes that favored acquisition, invoices for consultants who recommend purchases, and emails that used community protection as a euphemism for consolidation. Clara's team argued intent was charitable, that any purchases were in the community's interest. Her support network, neighbors who trusted her years of service, testified in her favor. The line between interest and self-interest is a tricky one. It's rarely a clean division. But the cumulative evidence was more narrative than anecdote. The climax came, as most climaxes do, with a human element. On the stand, Clara's composure slipped. She was asked a question about a specific transaction. Did she disclose her interest in the adjacent property to the board? Her answer was that she believed she had, but there was no record. The room held its breath, not the gasping kind, but a suspended moment when all the past small slights and the larger maneuvers lined up and became comprehensible. Her voice cracked, which is a small, human thing, but those cracks let light in. When the hearing officer released her decision, it was not a Hollywood moment of sudden justice with trumpets and vindication, but it was decisive. The finding was that Clara and several board members had breached their fiduciary duties by failing to disclose conflicts of interest and by using their positions to further transactions that benefited entities tied to them. The remedies were administrative and legal, restitution for certain funds, in order to unwind some transactions where feasible, removal from the board, and a requirement that future purchases be subject to community-wide votes with full disclosure. People celebrate verdicts as if they're doors slamming on the past, but life doesn't always provide such clear edges. Clara contested, of course, and the legal wrangling stretched into months. Some of the purchases were irreversible, bound now in the kind of paperwork that makes undoing them prohibitively expensive. The audit forced changes, transparency protocols, disclosure requirements, and a restructuring of how the HOA handled purchases and contracts. My mailbox never quite felt safe again, though the wood was repaired. Some of my neighbors stopped speaking to me because mea culpas are harder to earn than they are to lose. Clara moved away eventually, though she did not go quietly. She left with a small posse of supporters who insisted she'd been wronged by a system that punishes women who take charge. I don't know whether history will cast her as a visionary or a villain. Those stories are usually written by people who benefit from the ending. But here's the real part that people overlook when they imagine justice. For a time, the neighborhood felt unmoored. We had to learn how to be a community again without someone else drawing the map. We had to ask basic questions about who our decisions served. We learned that transparency is a muscle that must be exercised, otherwise it atrophies. And for me, the story changed me in ways I didn't expect. I used to think of property as a static thing, a house, a fence, a mailbox. After this, property felt like a story, a ledger of intentions. People leave their marks on land the same way they leave marks on lives, sometimes gently, sometimes with the blunt force of acquisition. I found that what I cared about was not just my porch or my lawn. It was the idea that neighbors decide together, that the rules that bind us must be visible to those bound by them. That's not a revolutionary thought. It's a humble one. There were tough moments. Clara and her lawyers tried to paint me as a thorn, an agitator. They hinted at financial motives, at personal grievances. People speculated. In the town, rumor is a kind of currency. But at the end, the thing that gave me peace wasn't vindication as much as the restoration of a mechanism. People had a vote. Facts mattered. Decisions had to be justified in public and not behind corporate names. You might wonder if I ever felt triumphant. For a second, maybe, when the audit report landed in my inbox like an envelope bearing sunlight. But triumph is a narrow thing. What I felt more of was exhaustion and relief folding together like a map being closed. The neighborhood was not wholly redeemed. We still had fences and petty disputes, and someone's dog that howled when the wind changed, but the architecture of power had been loosened. The future was uncertain in a way that felt honest. I'll tell you one more scene because people love scenes. Clara packed up her boxes and stood on the porch of her last Maple Ridge house, and she looked like someone who had been denied something she thought was owed. Her goodbye was not remorseful. It was practiced, the sort of farewell people rehearse when they know their departure will be dramatic. She waved to the neighbors who remained on her side and drove off with that practiced dignity. I watched from my porch, the one I'd bought 10 years earlier, and felt something that was almost pity for the idea of power that thinks itself everlasting. Now, months later, Maple Ridge Cove hums along. We voted in a new board with bylaws written in plainer language and a requirement that any potential purchase must be presented in full detail and put to a community vote. We set up a small oversight committee. We held a picnic where people actually asked good questions and had the patience to listen to the answers. It's still messy. Communities usually are. But it's our mess. The difference is, we know why it's messy. I tell this story because it matters that ordinary things can become extraordinary when people refuse to be pushed around. I tell it because power resides in forms that look gentle until you test them. I tell it because the mechanisms that enable consolidation are often legal and therefore invisible proxies, LLCs, stage closings, but they can be countered with other tools: patience, documentation, and community. If you're sitting there and you live in a place that has a board or a committee that matters to you, don't assume things are above board just because they're formal. Some folks left angry, some left quietly. There are scars, and there are also, curiously, small joys. Neighbors who had been silent now speak up. Someone organized a community garden that's already thriving in a place that had once been a contested parcel. A few months ago, a kid, no, not a child in the scenes, but a young neighbor planted tomatoes and named them in honor of that picnic where we first asked questions. It felt like a small, human victory. Before I wrap this up, because I promised you I'd end with something that nudges a conversation rather than closing it with a lecture, I'll say this plainly. Power that's accountable is not the enemy of order. It's the foundation of it. When people with authority are asked to explain themselves, they may be inconvenienced, but the system is healthier for it. When you have a process for accountability, you don't have to make enemies of your neighbors to protect your rights. You simply use the tools that are, surprisingly, available: transparency, audits, votes, documentation. So here's where I ask you, not for help in my fight, but for your attention in your own. If you've seen something like this in your community, your condo association, your city council, tell someone. Don't keep it all in. And if you've had a different experience, where transparency worked and leaders stepped back when questioned, share that too. It won't always be glamorous, but it will keep the porch light on for everyone else who wants to sit and think. If this story moved you, if it made you uncomfortable or hopeful or mad, share it. Talk to your neighbors. Read the deeds. Make the hard conversations ordinary. That's how communities remember that they belong to the people who live in them, not to the ones who think they can own the rules. Thank you for listening. If you've got a story like this or the exact opposite, tell it below. I'll read them. We all should.